Hello, I'm Julian North and I teach in the English department at Leicester University. I'm interested in 19th century literature and I've published on authors such as Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens and Mary Shelley. I teach a second year module on Gothic literature and we start with the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, and we end up with Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. I find that lots of students have studied Gothic at A-level and really like taking it further at university, so this is a very popular module. So in this lecture, I'm going to give you a little taste of what it might be like to study Gothic at university. I'm going to be talking about Gothic monsters and how 18th and 19th century Gothic texts make us reconsider our natural sense of recoil when we're presented with a monster and make us recognise how monstrosity happens, how monsters are made, and how perhaps we all have a certain degree of monstrosity within us. So I hope you enjoy the lecture. Gothic monsters. When we think of Gothic monsters, my guess is that these are the images that come to most people's minds. They're all from early 20th century cinema. Yet all of these monsters depicted come from 19th century novels. In this lecture, I'm going to be looking back at some of the original Gothic monsters from 18th and 19th century fiction. I'll be giving you a taste of some of the material I teach in a second year option module on the Gothic literature of this period. Here are some of the novels I'll be touching on today. The first Gothic novel, Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, Matthew Gregory Lewis's sensational The Monk, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Dracula by Bram Stoker. I'll be taking you on a whistle-stop tour of some of the monsters in these texts, and I'll suggest as I go different ways in which the Gothic genre opens up the idea of monstrosity and asks us as readers to revise our instinctive recoil from the monstrous. First of all, what do I mean by the Gothic genre? What, in other words, defines these novels as Gothic? Well, all of them in different ways remove us from the ordinary daylight world. Their settings are castles, abbeys, dungeons, remote mountains and seas, or the darkness of the inner city. Their characters may be ordinary to start with, but they quickly leave this behind them as they descend into worlds where the supernatural, violence, and extreme fear and desire are the new norms. One way of defining Gothic is to think about it as a cultural movement that explores and values everything that is other to the so-called norms of mainstream culture. Rather than happiness and reason, we get fear, terror, and desire. Rather than the natural, the supernatural. Rather than beauty, ugliness. All of these Gothic qualities, fear, terror, desire, the supernatural, the ugly, are contained within the idea of monstrosity. So who are the Gothic monsters? The most famous Gothic monsters of the 19th century are both human and not human, supernatural creatures and perpetrators of violence, including sexual violence and multiple murder. Most obviously, they are also all terrifying to look at. Hollywood knew how to get an audience in by the sheer visual horror of the monster, but this was also true of some of the original novels, although the details of what these characters looked like could be strikingly different. To take Dracula for a start, Bram Stoker describes him as unnaturally pale, with a long white moustache, massive bushy eyebrows meeting in the middle, long pointed nails, hairs on the palms of his hands, and of course a fixed and rather cruel-looking mouth with sharp, white teeth protruding over the lips. This animalistic, bat-like quality is preserved in an early German expressionist film, Nosferatu 1922, although without the moustache. The more lasting image was defined by Bela Lugosi in Dracula 1931, which shows him as more uncannily like a conventional matinee idol in a dinner suit. Frankenstein's monster, on the other hand, started out as beautiful and got increasingly hideous. In the novel, Frankenstein designs him to be the most beautiful of men, Unfortunately, since he's made from body parts collected from graveyards, the plan doesn't quite work out. Beautiful, great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes. They seemed almost the same colour as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shrivelled complexion and straight black lips. The creature got even more terrifying and less human on screen, of course, as Boris Karloff with a bolt through his neck. But early illustrations to the novel are nearer to Shelley's idea of the beauty and humanity of the monster. Another thing you might notice about this illustration is that the creature doesn't look radically different to his creator, seen here sneaking out of the room. Both of them have long black hair and staring, illuminated eyes. This, of course, picks up on the question posed by Mary Shelley's novel. Who is the real monster in the story? Is it Frankenstein or is it his creature? At first, readers assume it's the creature because they've only got Frankenstein's word for it. Frankenstein is the main narrator of the story, and it's through his eyes that we first see his creation. This prejudices the reader. We think of Frankenstein as the brilliant scientist and his creature as the hideous progeny, who goes on to murder innocent little William, Frankenstein's brother. But Mary Shelley makes a brilliant narrative twist in the middle of her novel. The creature gets to tell his side of the story. He meets up with Frankenstein on a glacier, and we hear his voice for the first time. He tells us how it felt to be him, to be abandoned at birth, and then to be rejected by all who saw him simply because he was ugly. This complicates our sympathies and makes us think about the monstrosity of our hero's behaviour in performing his irresponsible experiment. So Gothic makes the point that monstrosity isn't necessarily about appearance, nor is it necessarily about the supernatural. Monstrosity is something we're all capable of. In fact, in the early Gothic tradition, monsters are more often like Frankenstein human, privileged, gifted and beautiful men and women who still behave in monstrous ways. Here are two of these characters: Manfred, the hero of the Castle of Otranto, and Ambrosio from the Monk. If we take Manfred first, he is a powerful prince, but he's also a Macbeth-like figure who turns out to have usurped his power and his castle. At the beginning of the novel, a giant helmet drops from the sky and kills Manfred's son, who was on his way to get married. Without turning a hair, and despite already having a wife, Manfred sets off in pursuit of his son's fiancée. He's determined to marry her himself and preserve the line. His lust of power entails abandoning his wife, attempted forced marriage, and finally killing his own daughter by accident. Monstrous behaviour indeed. Ambrosio from the Monk is also a handsome and charismatic hero. In fact, at the beginning of the novel, Ambrosio is said to be so pure that he doesn't know the difference between a man and a woman. This is a situation that doesn't last long, however, when he's seduced by a demon in the shape of a beautiful woman, Matilda. Ambrosio's crimes in the novel include hypocrisy, murder, and incest. So Gothic gives us plenty of examples of monstrous behaviour in people who should know better. But it doesn't simply reject that behaviour as wrong. It explores what it is to be monstrous. It even asks us as readers to understand monstrosity. And it does this by asking what motivates some of these characters. Where did their evil come from? If we think about Ambrosio, for example, he commits a series of dreadful crimes, as we've seen, but about halfway through the book, Lewis steps aside from the narrative and explains how Ambrosio came to be as he is, how he was originally a promising child, in fact a paragon of virtue, compassion, courage, all the heroic virtues. He was naturally enterprising, firm and fearless. He had a warrior's heart. But he was orphaned and sent to be brought up by monks who indoctrinated him in the beliefs of their order to such an extent that they ruined his innate goodness, rooting out his virtues and narrowing his sentiments. So even the monstrous Ambrosio is torn between natural goodness and taught cruelty and vice. The different sentiments with which education and nature had inspired him were combating in his bosom, we hear. This is a struggle, in other words, between nature and nurture. And for Lewis in The Monk, it's nurture, upbringing, that makes men monstrous, not nature. In Frankenstein, both the hero and the creature tell their own stories, as we've seen. And this allows us to see how each of them became, in their different ways, monstrous. Both begin well, but both end badly. And we have to ask why. Frankenstein seems to be fatally damaged by the death of his mother and the need to compensate by his quest to defeat death itself through science. The creature is similarly naturally good, even to the extent of being a vegan living off berries. He commits violence only as a response to what he encounters from others, in this case his father's neglect and the hostility of strangers. When he meets Frankenstein on the glacier, the creature says, "I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy and I shall again be virtuous." These sentiments tie in with 18th century theories of child development and the origins of evil being in nurture rather than in nature. And here I would ask my students on my module to do a little bit of further reading and look at some extracts from a very influential 18th century theorist of education and childhood development, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his books Emile, or On Education, and his autobiography, The Confessions, Rousseau showed how the child is born virtuous, the child is naturally good. It's only society, and especially poor education, that corrupts. And I think that much Gothic fiction also shows us this. Monstrosity is a shared responsibility. It belongs to the monster, yes, but it also belongs to the rest of us, to the parent and others whose attitudes can make people monstrous. But what Gothic also shows us is that the ultimate reason we should pause before we reject monstrosity is that we all have elements of monstrosity within us. We're familiar with this idea from later Gothic, and especially from Jekyll and Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is a good man. Hyde is his repressed, unconscious, brute nature, disastrously released by science. And in this photograph, we can see that represented. This anticipates Freud by a few years, but we also get this idea way back in the 18th century. In this print, for instance, by Goya, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, we see a man asleep. His reason is put to rest, and as a result, from his unconscious, these monsters emerge: bats, gargoyles, owls. Another example. This is The Nightmare by Fuseli. We see a woman abandoned, possibly in sleep. On top of her perches an incubus, a hideous incubus, and from behind the curtain we see a horse's head, a mare with staring white eyes, the nightmare of the title. And this seems to represent the unconscious fears, possibly desires, of the dreaming mind. In the literature of the period too, in the Gothic literature, we have this interest in the monstrosity that can be released in the dream world. Here Frankenstein dreams of his future bride, Elizabeth. Kissing her, her lips became livid with the hues of death, and her features turn into those of his dead mother. It's an incest theme, complicated further by the fact that Elizabeth has been brought up as Frankenstein's sister. Another example from the monk. The monks have brought Ambrosio up to have no healthy outlet for his sexual passions. For a time, spare diet, frequent watching and severe penance cooled and repressed the natural warmth of his constitution. But no sooner did the opportunity present itself, no sooner did he catch a glimpse of joys to which he was still a stranger, than religion's barriers were too feeble to resist the overwhelming torrent of his desires. All impediments yielded before the force of his temperament, warm, sanguine, and voluptuous in the excess. This passage understands the mechanism of repression. It is potentially both healthy and unhealthy. In order for us to function at all, the desires that exist in our unconscious must be repressed, but allowed no outlet, they will break out in ways that are destructive, both to the individual and his society. This is exactly what happens to Ambrosio, and the violence of released desire is extreme. It includes fixating on the beautiful and innocent Antonia. He swore that cost what it would, he would still possess Antonia. Starting from the bed, he paced the chamber with disordered steps, howled with impotent fury, dashed himself violently against the walls, and indulged in transports of rage and madness. He rapes Antonia, and at this point it's hard to find sympathy with monstrosity. But Gothic also asks us to understand why we might be prejudiced against the monstrous, why we might define someone as monstrous. We've seen this in Frankenstein, and we also see it in my last example, Dracula, where we find a very clear example of how social prejudices, in this case about gender, might feed into our definition of what is monstrous. Lucy, having been bitten by Dracula, is now a vampire, one of the undead. Van Helsing, Arthur, Lucy's fiancé, and others set out to kill her. But what exactly are their grounds for doing this? Is it because she sucked the blood of babies? Well, yes, but not just that. As this passage reveals, the root of their concern is the nature of her monstrosity. She seemed like a nightmare of Lucy as she lay there, the pointed teeth, the blood-stained voluptuous mouth, which it made one shudder to see, the whole carnal and unspiritual appearance, seeming like a devilish mockery of Lucy's sweet purity. Lucy's sweet purity, a telling phrase. Concern here about an apparent loss of conventional femininity is perhaps uppermost in these men's minds. Her killing is meant to be merciful, but it is described in terms that suggest sexual violence. Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake. Afterwards, the gang rather perfunctorily cut off her head and filled her mouth with garlic. This raises the question of whose behaviour we should be condemning. Is it Lucy who is monstrous, or is it the self-righteous mainstream that drives a stake through her heart? In conclusion, with this attack on Lucy for being different in mind, we might notice how Gothic monstrosity has been adopted in contemporary culture as a positive, a way of asserting difference and rebellion against the mainstream. And here we see how contemporary Gothic has its origins in 18th and 19th century Gothic fiction. Well, thank you very much for listening to my lecture, and I hope that it stimulated some ideas. I'd be very happy to hear from any of you who want to know more about studying English at Leicester, especially if you're interested in 19th century literature and in the Gothic. Bye-bye then.